The pre-dawn mist clung to the hills surrounding Ouagadougou like a shroud, masking secrets that had festered in the shadows for months. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat in his modest office, steam rising from his third cup of coffee, when the encrypted phone buzzed against the mahogany desk his predecessor had left behind. The caller ID showed only numbers, his most trusted intelligence operative. "Captain," the voice was breathless, urgent. "We have a situation, code red." Traoré set down his cup with deliberate calm. In his 3 years as Burkina Faso's leader, he had learned that panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Speak." A farmer named Burema was herding his goats near the Pura Hills yesterday evening. His animals wandered off the path, and he followed them deeper into the restricted forest zone. What he found, pause, "Sir, you need to see this yourself." "Tell me now." "A massive mining operation, hidden deep in the forest, armed security, heavy machinery, dozens of workers. But Captain, these aren't our people running it. The trucks have no license plates, the supervisors are speaking American English, and the gold, tons of it, is being packed into crates marked as medical supplies." Traoré's jaw tightened. The Pura region had been declared a protected environmental zone 6 months ago. No mining permits had been issued, no government contracts signed, yet someone was extracting gold from Burkina Faso's soil under the cover of darkness. How long has this been operating? Based on the infrastructure we observed, at least 4 months, maybe longer. And our security forces in the region? A pause. "That's the problem, Captain. Some of our own uniforms were seen providing escort to the mining trucks." The coffee turned bitter in Traoré's mouth. Betrayal from within was always the deepest cut. He stood up, his 6-foot frame casting a long shadow across the wall map of Burkina Faso. Red pens marked legitimate mining operations. The Pura Hills showed nothing. "I want satellite imagery, thermal scans, and a complete surveillance package within the hour," he commanded, "and prepare the Scorpion unit for immediate deployment." "Sir, should we coordinate with—" "No." Traoré's voice was ice. "Tell no one. If there are traitors in our ranks, we'll catch them with their hands in our gold." He hung up and walked to the window overlooking the awakening capital. Vendors were setting up their stalls. Children were walking to school, and ordinary citizens were beginning another day, unaware that their national wealth was being pillaged while they slept. Traoré had sworn an oath to protect Burkina Faso from foreign exploitation. Today, that oath would be tested. Within an hour, his desk was covered with satellite images that made his blood boil. The hidden mining operation was vast. Bulldozers, excavators, processing facilities, and armed guards patrolling a perimeter that stretched for kilometers. Thermal imaging showed over 200 people working in shifts around the clock. Most disturbing were the clear images of white men in tactical gear directing operations, while African workers, some appearing dangerously young, labored in hazardous conditions without safety equipment. His intelligence chief, Colonel Sawadogo, entered with additional reconnaissance. "Captain, we've identified the vehicles. The trucks are unregistered, but their tire treads match patterns found at 3 other mining sites across West Africa. This isn't a local operation, it's part of a larger network." "What about the security escorts you mentioned?" Sawadogo's expression darkened. "We traced the uniforms. They belonged to units that were supposedly conducting environmental assessments in the region, Captain Kabore's detachment specifically." Kabore, Traoré remembered him, a reliable officer until his dismissal for insubordination 6 months ago. Or so it had seemed. "Find Kabore, quietly. I want to know who's been paying him and for how long." "There's more, Captain." Sawadogo placed a folder on the desk. "Financial intelligence tracked unusual money transfers. 3 of our government officials received substantial payments from offshore accounts in the past 4 months. The amounts correspond exactly with the timeline of this mining operation." Traoré opened the folder. Bank statements, wire transfer records, and photographs of luxury purchases made by officials whose salaries couldn't justify such expenses. His Minister of Natural Resources had bought a new Mercedes. The Deputy Minister of Internal Security had purchased a villa in Morocco. Most shocking was his own Minister of Mines, who deposited $800,000 into a Cayman Islands account just 3 weeks ago. "They sold us out," Traore whispered, more to himself than to Ouagadougou. "They sold their own country for Mercedes and villas." The weight of betrayal settled on his shoulders, but it quickly transformed into cold determination. He had seen what foreign exploitation did to African nations: the permanent poverty, the environmental destruction, the cultural erosion. It would not happen on his watch. "Colonel, I want the Scorpion unit mobilized immediately. 2 platoons, full tactical gear, media support, and air cover. We move at dawn." "What's the mission, Captain?" Traore looked at the satellite images one more time, memorizing the faces of the foreign supervisors and the layout of their illegal operation. "We're going to show the world what modern colonialism looks like, and then we're going to end it." Dawn was still 2 hours away when Traore's convoy departed Ouagadougou. 2 unmarked military trucks carried his elite Scorpion unit through the pre-dawn darkness, their headlights cutting through the mist like knives. Traore sat in the lead vehicle, studying intelligence reports and refining his strategy. This wasn't just about arresting criminals. It was about exposing a system of exploitation that had operated in shadows for too long. His plan was audacious. Rather than conducting a traditional military raid, he would first infiltrate the operation alone, gathering video evidence of the criminal activity. Then he would spring the trap with maximum media coverage, ensuring the world witnessed both the crime and the justice. "Captain," his communications officer spoke through the radio, "we're receiving chatter on encrypted channels. Someone's monitoring our movements." "Let them monitor," Traore replied, "but maintain radio silence from this point. We proceed on schedule." As they approached the forest perimeter, Traore could see the glow of industrial lighting through the trees. The illegal mining operation was running at full capacity, confident in their secrecy and protection. That confidence would be their downfall. At exactly 5:30 a.m., Traore exited his vehicle alone, dressed in civilian clothes with a small camera concealed in his shirt button. He had told his men to wait for his signal before moving into position. If there were traitors in his government, he needed evidence of their betrayal before they could destroy it. The forest was alive with the sounds of heavy machinery and shouted orders in multiple languages. As Traore approached the perimeter, he could see the scope of the operation more clearly. This wasn't a simple mining site. It was an industrial complex designed for maximum extraction with minimal oversight. Environmental regulations had been completely ignored. Workers labored without protective equipment, while toxic chemicals flowed freely into streams that fed local water supplies. A security guard approached, speaking in accented French. "This is a restricted area. You need to leave." Traore showed fake press credentials. "I'm a journalist investigating environmental issues. I received reports of unusual activity in this forest." The guard studied the credentials, then spoke into his radio in English. "We have a local reporter here. Instructions?" The response crackled back. "Bring him to the supervisor. We'll handle it." Perfect. Traore was being escorted directly into the heart of the operation. The supervisor was a tall American with sunburned skin and cold blue eyes who introduced himself as David Carter. His confidence was absolute, the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. "Mr. Carter," Traore began, in accented English, playing the role of a naive local journalist. "Can you tell me about this operation? The environmental groups are concerned about mining in protected areas." Carter laughed. Environmental groups? Son, this is development work. We're bringing jobs and investment to Burkina Faso. Your government specifically approved this project. May I see the permits? That's not your concern. What you need to understand is that this operation is creating employment for over 200 locals. We're processing gold that otherwise sit unused in the ground. As Carter spoke, Traore's hidden camera captured everything: the American supervisors, the working conditions, the lack of safety equipment, and, most importantly, the children among the workers. Some couldn't have been older than 14. Where does the gold go after processing? Traore asked innocently. Through proper channels, first to Abidjan for quality certification, then international markets, everything completely legal. And the local workers? What do they earn? Carter's expression hardened slightly. They earn what the market determines. This isn't charity, it's business. Traore nodded as if satisfied, but his camera continued recording. He had seen enough to confirm his worst suspicions. This wasn't just illegal mining, it was a systematic exploitation of Burkina Faso's resources and people, operating under the protection of corrupt officials who had sold their integrity for foreign money. Thank you for your time, Mr. Carter. This has been very educational. As Traore walked back toward the forest perimeter, he activated his encrypted radio. Scorpion Leader, to all units, the trap is set. Begin Operation Golden Truth. Within minutes, the forest was surrounded by 300 heavily armed Special Forces soldiers. Helicopters appeared overhead, while ground units sealed every escape route. The illegal mining operation, which had operated in secrecy for months, suddenly found itself under siege. Traore walked back into the mining complex, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him marched 2 platoons of elite soldiers, followed by journalists, cameramen, and drone operators. His hidden camera had been replaced by official government recording equipment. The Americans stood frozen as soldiers took positions around the mining equipment. Some tried to run but found their escape routes blocked. Others attempted to destroy computer hard drives but were stopped before they could complete the deletions. "Gentlemen," Traore announced in clear English, his voice carrying across the mining site, "you are under arrest for illegal mining, environmental destruction, exploitation of miners, and theft of national resources." David Carter stepped forward, his earlier confidence evaporating. "Now wait a minute, we have permits. This operation was approved by your government. Show me these permits." Traore demanded. Carter gestured frantically to his subordinates, who produced a folder of documents. Traore examined them carefully, his lawyers and legal advisors reviewing each page. The documents bore official seals and signatures, but they were forgeries, sophisticated ones that had been created with inside knowledge of government procedures. "These documents are fraudulent," Traore announced for the cameras. "The signatures are forged, the permit numbers don't exist in our government database, and the authorizing officials were dismissed from government service before these permits were allegedly issued." The Americans exchanged nervous glances. Their protective cover was dissolving in real time. "Furthermore," Traore continued, walking among the gold processing equipment, "this operation has violated every environmental protection law in Burkina Faso. You have contaminated water sources, destroyed protected forest, and endangered the health of local communities." He pointed to the youngest workers, some of whom were clearly minors. "You have exploited children, paying them subsistence wages while extracting millions of dollars worth of gold from our soil. The international journalists captured every word, every image. This wasn't just a local story. It was becoming a global exposé of modern economic colonialism. But Traore wasn't finished. The real revelations were yet to come. As soldiers secured the mining site and arrested the American supervisors, Traore's intelligence team was conducting simultaneous raids across Ouagadougou. His investigation had revealed that the illegal mining operation was just one tentacle of a much larger conspiracy involving government officials, international corporations, and foreign interests. His Minister of Mines, Dr. Amadou Sankara, was arrested at his residence as he attempted to burn documents in his backyard. The Deputy Minister of Internal Security was apprehended at the airport with suitcases full of cash and a one-way ticket to Dubai. Most shocking was the arrest of Colonel Traore, who was found at a luxury hotel in Abidjan, apparently coordinating the evacuation of American personnel. Back at the mining site, Traore ordered the arrested Americans to be brought before the assembled media. They knelt in front of the gold they had stolen, their faces ashen with defeat and fear. "Tell the world who helped you," Traore demanded. David Carter remained silent, but his younger associate, Scott Harper, broke under pressure. "We were approached by a man named Kamar Ouedraogo. He claimed to represent both the Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast governments. He said this operation had been approved at the highest levels. What did you pay him?" $2.5 million initially, then monthly payments of $200,000. The crowd of journalists wrote furiously. Cameras zoomed in, and satellite feeds carried the confession across the globe. And who provided security? He hesitated, looking at his colleagues. "We were told they were official government forces. They wore your military uniforms and carried proper identification. Which officials approved this operation?" "Kamar introduced us to several ministers. They attended dinners, signed documents, and assured us that everything was legal. We were told that President Traore himself had approved the project as part of a new economic initiative." Traore's jaw clenched. His own name had been used to legitimize this theft. "I never approved any such project. These men were deceived by criminals who forged my authorization." He turned to address the cameras directly. "Citizens of Burkina Faso, what you are witnessing today is the exposure of a criminal network that has been operating within our own government. Officials you trusted sold our national wealth to foreign corporations while lying to both the buyers and our people." The political earthquake was immediate. Protests erupted across Ouagadougou as citizens demanded accountability. Government buildings were surrounded by crowds chanting Traore's name and calling for the prosecution of the corrupt officials. But the investigation revealed even deeper connections. Kamar Ouedraogo wasn't just a local fixer. He was part of an international network that had been facilitating similar operations across West Africa. Bank records showed payments flowing to officials in Mali, Niger, and Guinea-Bissau. The theft of Burkina Faso's gold was part of a systematic looting of the region's mineral wealth. Even more disturbing were the intercepted communications between Kamar and officials in Abidjan. The Ivory Coast government hadn't just been aware of the operation, they had been actively facilitating it, providing transportation corridors and export documentation in exchange for substantial bribes. "This is not just about Burkina Faso," Traore announced to the assembled media. "This is about the systematic exploitation of Africa by networks of corruption that span borders and governments. Today, we begin to break those networks." As evidence mounted, international pressure began building. The European Union launched an investigation into the companies involved. The United States Congress announced hearings on American corporate involvement in African resource theft. Most significantly, the African Union called for an emergency session to address what they termed neo-colonial resource extraction. But the most dramatic revelation was yet to come. Hidden among Camar's documents was evidence of a much larger conspiracy involving French intelligence services and multinational corporations with contracts worth billions of dollars. The illegal mining operation in Burkina Faso was just a pilot project for a continent-wide resource extraction scheme. The discovery of French intelligence involvement elevated the scandal from regional corruption to international crisis. Intercepted communications between French intelligence officers and Camar detailed payments, transportation routes, and protection schemes. One message, dated just 3 weeks before Traore's raid, discussed the need to accelerate extraction before the new government discovers our arrangements. More explosive was the revelation that similar operations were active in 5 other African countries, all former French colonies. The network had stolen an estimated $2 billion worth of gold and rare minerals over the past 2 years, using shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands to launder the proceeds. When Traore released this evidence publicly, the response was swift and global. The French government denied involvement, claiming the intelligence officers had acted without authorization. The American companies involved began legal proceedings to distance themselves from the scandal. Most tellingly, several high-ranking officials in partner countries suddenly announced their resignations for personal reasons. But the conspiracy's reach extended beyond government corruption. Investigation revealed that major international banks had processed the illegal transactions. Luxury goods dealers had sold assets to corrupt officials, and even humanitarian organizations had been unwittingly used to transport stolen gold labeled as medical supplies. The web of complicity was vast and sophisticated. What appeared to be isolated corruption was actually a systematic network designed to extract African wealth while maintaining plausible deniability for all participants. Traore realized that exposing the conspiracy was only the beginning. Dismantling it would require international cooperation and sustained pressure on the individuals and institutions that had enabled the theft. While international attention focused on the captured Americans and corrupt officials, Traore's priority was finding Camar Ouedraogo, the architect of the conspiracy. Intelligence indicated he had fled to Abidjan, where he maintained a network of safe houses and corrupt contacts. Rather than requesting Camar's extradition through diplomatic channels, which would alert his accomplices and allow evidence to be destroyed, Traore decided on a more direct approach. He would travel to Ivory Coast personally, conduct his own investigation, and confront the conspiracy at its source. The decision was controversial among his advisors. "Captain," Colonel Ouedraogo argued, "traveling to Abidjan without diplomatic protection is extremely dangerous. These people have already threatened your life. They have resources, connections, and no scruples about violence." "Precisely why I must go," Traore replied. "If we wait for official channels, Camar will disappear, his network will scatter, and the stolen gold will be lost forever. Sometimes justice requires bold action." At dawn, Traore's plane departed Ouagadougou with minimal fanfare. His team consisted of only his translator, a trusted bodyguard, and a technical specialist equipped with surveillance equipment. The mission was to locate Camar, gather evidence of his operations, and expose the Ivorian connections that had enabled the conspiracy. Intelligence had tracked Kamar to a luxury villa in Cocody, an upscale Abidjan neighborhood popular with wealthy businessmen and corrupt officials. The villa was registered to a shell company, but financial records showed it was purchased with proceeds from the illegal mining operations. Traore's approach was methodical. Rather than immediately confronting Kamar, he spent 2 days conducting surveillance, documenting the villa's visitors and mapping the network of accomplices who enabled Kamar's operations. What he discovered was even more extensive than anticipated. The villa served as headquarters for a regional corruption network involving officials from 6 countries. Mining executives, government ministers, military officers, and intelligence operatives met regularly to coordinate resource extraction operations across West Africa. On the 3rd day, Traore decided to act. As Kamar prepared to leave the villa for what appeared to be another coordination meeting, Traore's team intercepted him in the compound's garden. "Mr. Wedrigo," Traore said calmly as his bodyguard restrained the surprised fixer, "we need to discuss your business arrangements." Kamar's initial shock quickly gave way to arrogance. "Captain Traore, you have no authority here. This is Ivory Coast and you are operating illegally on foreign soil. I'm operating in pursuit of justice. Your criminal network has stolen from my people, corrupted our officials, and endangered our sovereignty. That gives me all the authority I need." Inside the villa, Traore's team discovered a treasure trove of evidence. Filing cabinets contained contracts, financial records, and correspondence detailing the full scope of the conspiracy. Computer hard drives held encrypted communications, payment schedules, and operational plans for future resource extraction projects. Most damaging were the photographs. Images of Kamar meeting with high-ranking officials from multiple countries, documents bearing official seals and signatures, and receipts for bribes totaling millions of dollars. The evidence was comprehensive and undeniable. But Kamar wasn't finished. As Traore's team secured the documents, Kamar made a desperate offer. "Captain, you don't understand the scope of what you're dealing with. This network extends to the highest levels of government across the region. Presidents, ministers, military commanders, they all participate. If you expose this, you'll destabilize half of West Africa." "Good," Traore replied. "It's time for that destabilization. Your network has been a cancer on our continent for too long. But the alternative isn't better governance, it's chaos. These operations provide stability, jobs, investment. Without them, the region will collapse into poverty and conflict." Traore studied Kamar's face, seeing the fear beneath his attempted manipulation. "What you call stability is exploitation. What you call investment is theft. The chaos you predict is already here. It's just been hidden by your corruption." As evidence of the conspiracy mounted, Traore made another bold decision. Rather than quietly extracting Kamar and the evidence, he would hold a public press conference in Abidjan, exposing the network while standing in its headquarters. The press conference in Kamar's seized villa was unlike anything seen in recent West African history. International journalists, local media, and diplomatic observers crowded into the marble-floored lounge, while Traore displayed evidence of the conspiracy on tables throughout the room. The setting was deliberate and powerful. Surrounded by the luxury purchased with stolen African wealth, Traore methodically exposed each element of the criminal network. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, holding up financial records, "what you see here is not corruption, it's colonialism, sophisticated, systematic, and designed to maintain African poverty while enriching foreign mining companies and their local accomplices." He displayed bank statements showing millions of dollars flowing from American mining companies to shell accounts controlled by African officials. These payments weren't bribes, they were salaries. Officials across the region were employed by foreign corporations to facilitate resource theft while maintaining the appearance of legitimate government. The evidence was overwhelming. Contracts detailing resource extraction quotas, transportation schedules coordinated with military units, and export documentation that circumvented national accounting systems. The conspiracy had operated with industrial efficiency and governmental protection. This network, Traore continued, has stolen an estimated $2 billion worth of gold, diamonds, and rare minerals from West Africa over the past 2 years. Money that should have built schools, hospitals, and infrastructure instead purchased villas, luxury cars, and foreign bank accounts. But the most explosive revelation concerned French intelligence involvement. Encrypted communications showed coordination between French operatives and the criminal network, including intelligence sharing, logistical support, and political protection. France has spent decades claiming to support African development while secretly facilitating African exploitation. Today, we expose that hypocrisy. The response was immediate and global. French officials denied involvement while launching their own investigation. American congressional leaders called for hearings on corporate accountability. Most significantly, African Union members began coordinating their own investigations into similar operations in their countries. As Traore spoke, Camar sat handcuffed in the corner, his network exposed and his protection evaporated. But he wasn't finished trying to save himself. "If I cooperate," he called out during the press conference, "I can provide information about operations in 12 countries. Bank accounts, government contacts, corporate executives, everything." Traore paused his presentation. "Then start talking." Camar's confession, delivered before international media in his own seized villa, provided a comprehensive map of corruption across West Africa. Speaking in French, English, and local languages, he detailed a network that had operated with stunning scope and sophistication. The Americans weren't the architects, they were clients. The real architects were European intelligence services and multinational corporations who needed African resources but couldn't access them through legitimate channels due to environmental regulations and labor laws. He described a system where African officials were recruited not as individual corrupt actors, but as employees of a shadow economy. They weren't taking bribes. They were working for international corporations who paid better than their own governments. The payments were structured to avoid detection. Rather than direct transfers, money flowed through charitable foundations, consulting contracts, and investment funds. Officials received scholarships for their children to attend European universities, consulting fees for reports they never wrote, and investment opportunities in projects that existed only on paper. The mining operation in Burkina Faso was just one piece, Camar continued. Similar operations were active in Mali, Guinea, Niger, and Chad. Each country had its own network of officials, but they were all coordinated from regional headquarters in Abidjan and Paris. The transportation networks were equally sophisticated. Stolen resources moved through carefully planned routes using diplomatic pouches, humanitarian shipments, and commercial cargo containers. Export documentation was forged using real government systems, making the theft appear legitimate to international auditors. We processed over $2 billion worth of African resources through this network: gold, diamonds, rare earth minerals, even uranium. European and American corporations received materials they couldn't obtain legally. African officials received payments far exceeding their government salaries, and only the African people lost. But the most disturbing aspect of his confession concerned future plans. The network hadn't just been stealing existing resources, they had been mapping future extraction opportunities using satellite technology and geological surveys funded by international development agencies. We identified resource deposits across sub-Saharan Africa worth an estimated $50 billion. The plan was to gradually expand operations until we controlled the majority of the continent's mineral wealth. As his confession continued, law enforcement agencies across multiple countries began coordinating arrests. Bank accounts were frozen, assets were seized, and international warrants were issued. The conspiracy that had operated in shadows was being dismantled in real time. The exposure of the West African resource theft network triggered consequences far beyond the original mining operation in Burkina Faso. Within 48 hours of Kamar's confession, investigations were launched in 12 countries, while international markets reacted to the revelation of systematic resource manipulation. The European Union suspended aid programs to affected countries pending investigation of how development funds had been misused. The United Nations Security Council called an emergency session to address what they termed systematic resource colonialism. Most significantly, the International Criminal Court announced investigations into crimes against humanity related to the exploitation of African workers and environmental destruction. Corporate responses were swift and defensive. The American mining companies involved in the Burkina Faso operation declared bankruptcy, claiming they had been deceived by local partners. European corporations with exposure to the network hired international law firms and launched public relations campaigns to distance themselves from the scandal. But the evidence was too comprehensive for effective denial. Leaked emails showed corporate executives discussing the illegal nature of their operations while calculating profits from stolen resources. Internal memos revealed knowledge of child labor, environmental destruction, and government corruption. The political consequences were equally dramatic. 3 African presidents announced early elections under pressure from protests and opposition parties. The French government recalled its intelligence chief and launched an internal investigation. Several American congressmen called for hearings on corporate accountability and foreign resource extraction. In Burkina Faso, the revelations strengthened Traore's position while validating his anti-corruption agenda. Public approval ratings soared as citizens saw their leader successfully confronting the powerful interests that had exploited their country for decades. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the emergence of a Pan-African movement demanding accountability for resource extraction. Coordinated protests across the continent called for renegotiation of mining contracts, prosecution of corrupt officials, and repatriation of stolen wealth. This is not just about gold or corruption, Traore explained to international media. This is about African sovereignty. For too long, our resources have been extracted by foreign interests while our people remain poor. Today, we begin to change that dynamic. 6 months after the exposure of the conspiracy, international attention focused on Ouagadougou as the captured American executives and corrupt African officials faced trial. The proceedings, broadcast globally, became a symbol of African resistance to economic exploitation. The courtroom was packed with journalists, diplomats, and citizens eager to see justice served. Traore, now serving as both president and prosecutor, presented evidence methodically and comprehensively. "Distinguished judges," he began, "the defendants before you are not merely criminals, they are representatives of a system that has kept Africa impoverished while enriching foreign interests. Today we hold that system accountable." The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, communications, video footage, and witness testimony painted a complete picture of the conspiracy. The American executives had knowingly participated in illegal resource extraction while corrupting African officials and exploiting local workers. David Carter, the lead American defendant, attempted to claim ignorance. "We were told the operation was legal. We relied on local partners who assured us they had proper government authorization. Traore's response was devastating. Mr. Carter, your own emails discuss the illegal nature of this operation. You wrote, and I quote, "The locals don't know what they're sitting on, and their government is too corrupt to protect it. We can extract what we want and pay a fraction of market value." The African defendants faced even harsher scrutiny. Their betrayal of their own people was seen as particularly egregious by both the court and public opinion. Dr. Amadou Sankara, the former Minister of Mines, broke down during testimony. "I never intended to harm Burkina Faso. I was approached by people who said this was development investment. They offered my family security I could never provide on a government salary. And in exchange for that security," Traore replied, "you sold your country's future. You authorized the theft of resources that belonged to all Burkinabe people while accepting personal payment from foreign corporations." The trial revealed new details about the conspiracy's scope and sophistication. International experts testified about the environmental damage caused by unregulated mining. Child welfare advocates described the exploitation of minor workers. Economic analysts calculated the full cost of the theft to Burkina Faso's development. But the most powerful testimony came from ordinary Burkinabe citizens whose lives had been affected by the conspiracy. Farmers described contaminated water sources that killed their livestock. Parents spoke of children who had been recruited as mine workers instead of attending school. Community leaders explained how the theft of mineral wealth had prevented investment in local infrastructure and services. "Your Honor," testified Fatima Wadagora, a teacher from a village near the illegal mine, "these men stole our children's futures. The gold they took could have built schools, trained teachers, and created opportunities for the next generation. Instead, it sits in foreign bank accounts while our children struggle without proper education." As the evidence mounted, public support for severe sentences grew across Burkina Faso and throughout Africa. Street demonstrations called for maximum punishment, while international observers noted the significance of the trial as a test of African judicial independence. The sentences, when announced, were historic. The American executives received lengthy prison terms and were ordered to pay massive restitution. The African corrupt officials faced even harsher punishment, with several receiving life sentences for treason. But Traore used the sentencing ceremony to deliver a broader message about African sovereignty and international accountability. "Today," Traore announced as the sentences were delivered, "Africa says no more. No more theft of our resources, no more corruption of our officials, no more exploitation of our people. The era of economic colonialism ends here." The trial's conclusion marked the beginning of a new phase in Traore's anti-corruption campaign. The recovered gold and seized assets were invested in education, healthcare, and infrastructure projects across Burkina Faso. The illegal mining site was converted into a national monument and museum, documenting the country's struggle against exploitation. More significantly, the success in Burkina Faso inspired similar movements across Africa. Ghana launched investigations into suspicious mining operations. Mali began auditing resource extraction contracts. Nigeria established new oversight mechanisms for foreign investment in natural resources. The international response was equally transformative. The European Union implemented new regulations requiring transparency in resource extraction investments. The United States Congress passed legislation mandating corporate accountability for overseas operations. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund began requiring detailed audits of resource-based development projects. But perhaps the most important change was psychological. The successful exposure and prosecution of the conspiracy demonstrated that African nations could successfully confront powerful international interests when they acted with determination and transparency. "We have shown the world that Africa is not helpless," Traore explained in his post-trial address to the nation. "We have resources, intelligence, and determination. When we use these assets to protect our sovereignty, we cannot be defeated." The broader implications extended beyond resource extraction to questions of development policy, international relations, and African unity. The conspiracy's exposure had revealed the extent to which traditional development models had been compromised by corruption and exploitation. In response, Traore proposed a new framework for African development based on transparency, accountability, and genuine partnership with international investors. "We welcome foreign investment," he declared, "but only on terms that benefit our people and respect our sovereignty." The success of this approach attracted international attention and investment. Companies seeking legitimate partnerships with African governments began viewing Burkina Faso as a model for ethical business practices. International development agencies redesigned their programs to emphasize transparency and local ownership. Most importantly, the young people of Burkina Faso and across Africa saw a new possibility for their continent's future. The successful confrontation with corruption and exploitation demonstrated that change was possible when leaders acted with courage and integrity. As Traore reflected on the events that had transformed his presidency and his country, he understood that the fight against exploitation was far from over. But the precedent had been established, the network had been exposed, and the movement for African sovereignty had gained unstoppable momentum. "This is not the end of our struggle," he concluded in his final address about the conspiracy. "It is the beginning of our liberation. Today we have shown the world that Africa stands up for itself. The world must listen." The golden conspiracy that had sought to impoverish Burkina Faso had instead become the catalyst for a new era of African empowerment. The resources that foreign interests had tried to steal became the foundation for genuine development. The corruption that had weakened government became the justification for radical transparency. In the end, the attempt to exploit Africa's wealth had backfired spectacularly, creating instead a powerful movement for continental sovereignty and economic justice. 2 years after the exposure of the Golden Conspiracy, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood once again in the hills of Pura. But the landscape had been transformed. Where illegal mining operations had once scarred the earth, a modern educational complex now rose from the rehabilitated soil. The Pura Institute for African Development, built with funds recovered from the conspiracy, had become a symbol of how stolen wealth could be reclaimed and redirected toward genuine progress. The Institute's mission was ambitious: to train a new generation of African leaders in resource management, governance, and economic development. Students from across the continent came to study models of transparent leadership and sustainable development. The curriculum included case studies of the Golden Conspiracy, ensuring that future leaders understood both the methods of exploitation and the strategies for resistance. Every classroom in this institute was built with gold that criminals tried to steal from our people. Now it educates the leaders who will prevent such theft in the future, Traore explained to visiting dignitaries. The success of the Burkina Faso model had indeed spread across Africa. In Ghana, President Akufo-Addo had implemented similar transparency measures for mining operations, resulting in a 40% increase in government revenues from resource extraction. Nigeria had established an African Resource Monitoring Center that tracked suspicious mining and export activities across the continent. Even smaller nations like Benin and Togo had begun demanding greater accountability from foreign investors. The international implications were equally significant. The exposure of the conspiracy had led to fundamental changes in how multinational corporations approached African investments. The era of operating through corruption and exploitation had become too risky, both legally and reputationally. Companies now competed to demonstrate their commitment to ethical practices and community development. The French government, after initially denying involvement, had eventually acknowledged the role of rogue intelligence operatives in facilitating the conspiracy. As part of diplomatic reconciliation, France had provided substantial development aid to affected countries and supported the establishment of international monitoring mechanisms for resource extraction. American corporations had faced even more severe consequences. Congressional investigations had led to new legislation requiring detailed reporting of overseas mining operations. Several companies had paid billions in fines and restitution, while their executives faced ongoing legal proceedings in multiple jurisdictions. But the human story was perhaps most compelling. Fatima Ouedraogo, the teacher who had testified at the trial about her village's contaminated water, now served as principal of a new school built with recovered funds. Her students studied in modern classrooms with computers, laboratories, and libraries that would have been impossible under the old system of resource theft. "My children now have opportunities I never imagined," she explained to visiting journalists. "They study technology, science, and leadership. Some will become doctors, engineers, and yes, honest government officials. They represent Africa's true wealth, not the gold in our soil, but the potential in our people." The former mining site itself had been converted into a memorial and museum documenting the struggle against economic colonialism. Visitors could see the actual equipment used in the illegal operation, read the documents that exposed the conspiracy, and learn about the individuals who had risked everything to defend their nation's sovereignty. Kamar Odekorogo, now serving a 25-year sentence in a Ouagadougou prison, had become an unlikely educator. His detailed knowledge of international corruption networks made him valuable to investigators across Africa. In exchange for cooperation, his sentence had been reduced, and he now worked with anti-corruption agencies to identify and prevent similar schemes. "I helped create a system that stole billions from Africa," he reflected during a supervised interview. "Now I'm trying to help destroy that system. It's the only way I can partially atone for the damage I caused." David Carter and his American colleagues remained in Burkina Faso prisons, their requests for transfer to U.S. facilities repeatedly denied. They had become symbols of international accountability, proof that powerful foreigners could not escape justice when they exploited African resources. The broader geopolitical implications continued to unfold. China, observing the success of transparent resource partnerships in Burkina Faso, had begun modifying its own African investment strategies to emphasize genuine development partnerships rather than resource extraction deals. The European Union had established new mechanisms for monitoring member countries' involvement in African resource sectors. Most significantly, the African Union had created the Continental Resource Protection Agency, headquartered in Ouagadougou, as recognition of Burkina Faso's leadership in exposing international exploitation. The agency coordinated intelligence sharing, monitored suspicious activities, and supported member countries in negotiating fair resource extraction agreements. As Traore prepared to step down from the presidency to focus on continental leadership roles, he reflected on the lessons of the Golden Conspiracy. The attempt to steal Burkina Faso's wealth ultimately strengthened the country and catalyzed a movement for African economic sovereignty. They thought they could rob Africa in darkness, he mused during his farewell address. Instead, they forced us to turn on the lights. Now the whole world can see our strength, our resources, and our determination to control our own destiny. The final irony was perhaps most satisfying. The American and European corporations that had sought to steal African gold at below-market prices now found themselves paying premium rates for access to African resources through legitimate partnerships. The conspiracy that was meant to impoverish Africa had ultimately empowered the continent to demand fair value for its wealth. Young people across Africa wore T-shirts bearing Traore's image and the slogan, "Our gold, our future." Universities established courses in African resource sovereignty. Artists created songs, films, and books celebrating the victory over economic colonialism. The Golden Conspiracy had ended not just with the arrest of criminals and recovery of stolen wealth, but with the birth of a new African consciousness. A generation of leaders had learned that they could successfully confront international exploitation when they acted with courage, transparency, and unity. As the sun set over the Pura Institute, casting golden light across the educational complex built from recovered stolen gold, the symbolism was unmistakable. What criminals had tried to steal in darkness had become the foundation for a brighter African future built in the full light of transparency and justice. The Golden Conspiracy was over. The golden age of African sovereignty had begun. But the story was not yet finished. 3 months after Traore's farewell address, as he prepared to assume leadership of the Continental Resource Protection Agency, a new threat emerged from the shadows of the dismantled conspiracy. Dr. Elena Marchetti, a former intelligence operative who had coordinated European aspects of the Golden Conspiracy, had escaped prosecution by fleeing to South America. From her base in Paraguay, she had spent months rebuilding connections and planning revenge against the African leaders who had destroyed her network. Her new strategy was more sophisticated than simple resource theft. Using contacts in international media and diplomatic circles, she began spreading disinformation about the Burkina Faso success story. Fabricated reports appeared in European newspapers claiming that Traore's anti-corruption campaign had damaged legitimate business interests and destabilized regional economies. The African Resource Protection Agency is nothing more than economic nationalism disguised as anti-corruption, she told sympathetic journalists. They are driving away legitimate investment and creating conditions for Chinese dominance. The disinformation campaign was carefully crafted to exploit international concerns about African stability and Western economic interests. Reports appeared in respected publications suggesting that Burkina Faso's new transparency requirements were scaring away needed foreign investment. More dangerously, Marchetti began reaching out to disinfected elements within African governments. Officials who had lost lucrative opportunities due to the new accountability measures. She offered them support for moderate approaches to resource management that would balance transparency with practical considerations. The first sign of this counter-conspiracy appeared in Mali, where several officials began questioning the wisdom of following Burkina Faso's extreme transparency model. Anonymous reports suggested that Mali was losing mining contracts to less restrictive countries, creating unemployment and reducing government revenues. "They're using our success against us," he explained to his intelligence team. "They can't defeat us with crude theft anymore, so they're trying to convince our own people that transparency is economically harmful." The counterattack was subtle, but effective. Several African leaders who had initially embraced the Burkina Faso model began expressing doubts. International investors began demanding flexibility in transparency requirements. Even some civil society organizations began questioning whether the new accountability measures were too restrictive. But Marchetti's most dangerous weapon was her network of corrupt media contacts. Stories began appearing suggesting that the original Golden Conspiracy had been exaggerated, that the prosecuted officials had been scapegoated, and that the economic benefits of the new transparency were illusory. Recognizing that this new battle would be fought in the realm of information rather than physical confrontation, Traore assembled a different kind of team. Instead of soldiers and intelligence operatives, he recruited journalists, economists, and digital communications experts. The Continental Resource Protection Agency launched Operation Truth Light, a comprehensive counter-disinformation campaign designed to document and publicize the real results of transparent resource management. The evidence was overwhelming. Countries that had implemented transparency measures were showing measurable improvements in education, healthcare, and infrastructure development. Foreign investment was actually increasing as legitimate companies sought partnerships with accountable governments. "Look at the numbers," Traore declared during a continental summit broadcast across Africa. "Burkina Faso's GDP has grown 15% since we ended the illegal mining operations. Ghana's education budget has doubled since implementing transparent mining contracts. Nigeria's healthcare system has expanded to reach millions more citizens using properly accounted resource revenues." The agency published detailed economic analyses comparing countries with transparent resource management to those maintaining old systems of corruption and exploitation. The results were stark. Transparency nations were consistently outperforming corruption nations in every measure of human development. But the disinformation network responded with increasingly sophisticated attacks. Fake economic reports appeared on professional-looking websites. Fabricated testimonials from concerned citizens were disseminated through social media. Even some legitimate academics were convinced to write papers questioning the sustainability of the transparency model. The turning point came when Traore's intelligence team traced the funding for the disinformation campaign back to its sources. Using techniques learned during the original Golden Conspiracy investigation, they followed digital money trails and communication networks to expose the counter-conspiracy's structure. The evidence was damning. Marchetti's operation was funded by some of the same multinational corporations that had participated in the original resource theft network. European and American companies that had been forced to pay massive fines and restitution were now funding disinformation campaigns to undermine the African leaders who had exposed them. Traore's response to the disinformation campaign was characteristically bold and transparent. Rather than fighting the lies in secret, he decided to expose the entire counter-conspiracy in real time, using the same dramatic techniques that had been successful against the original Golden Conspiracy. The Continental Resource Protection Agency organized Digital Truth Day, a 24-hour global broadcast during which they systematically exposed each element of the disinformation network. Using satellite links, internet streams, and traditional media, they reached audiences across Africa and around the world. "Ladies and gentlemen," Traore began the broadcast from the agency's headquarters in Ouagadougou. "Today we show you how the enemies of African sovereignty are using lies and deception to try to restore the system of exploitation we defeated." The presentation was methodical and devastating. Intelligence analysts displayed the funding flows from guilty corporations to disinformation operations. Communications experts demonstrated how fake news stories were created and disseminated. Economists presented real data contradicting the fabricated reports about economic damage from transparency measures. Most dramatically, they revealed Marchetti's role in coordinating the campaign from Paraguay. Intercepted communications showed her directing the creation of false reports, coordinating with corrupt media contacts, and planning strategies to undermine African resource sovereignty. Dr. Elena Marchetti, Traore announced, displaying her photograph and current location, was one of the architects of the original Golden Conspiracy. Now she leads the effort to restore that system through lies and manipulation. She cannot defeat us with truth, so she wages war with falsehood. The broadcast included testimonials from African citizens whose lives had been improved by transparent resource management. Farmers described clean water systems built with properly accounted mining revenues. Students showed off schools equipped with computers and laboratories funded by fair resource contracts. Healthcare workers demonstrated medical equipment purchased with transparent government budgets. This is what transparency produces, not economic hardship, but shared prosperity, not foreign investment flight, but ethical partnerships, not instability, but genuine development. The response was immediate and global. African audiences rallied around their leaders, rejecting the disinformation and demanding continued transparency. International media began investigating the disinformation network, exposing the corporate funding and deceptive practices. Most importantly, legitimate international investors began publicly supporting the transparency model, recognizing that accountable governments made better long-term partners than corrupt regimes. The exposure of the disinformation campaign triggered a global reckoning with corporate accountability and international information warfare. The revelation that major multinational corporations were funding systematic disinformation to undermine African sovereignty sparked outrage in both Africa and the global community. The United Nations Security Council called emergency sessions to address what they termed information colonialism, the use of disinformation by wealthy interests to undermine developing nations' sovereignty. The European Union launched investigations into the corporations involved, threatening massive additional fines and criminal prosecutions. In the United States, congressional leaders who had initially supported the corporate accountability measures after the original Golden Conspiracy now demanded even stronger regulations. If American corporations are funding disinformation campaigns against African democracy, declared Senator Elizabeth Warren, then we need laws with real teeth to stop them. The corporate response was swift and defensive, but the evidence was too comprehensive for effective denial. Internal documents showed deliberate strategies to undermine African resource sovereignty through information warfare. Communications revealed coordination between multiple companies and disinformation operatives. Several corporations attempted to distance themselves from Marchetti's operations, claiming they had been deceived about the nature of their funding. But investigators found evidence of direct communication between corporate executives and disinformation coordinators, proving conscious participation in the conspiracy. The legal consequences were severe. The same companies that had paid billions in fines for the original resource theft conspiracy now faced additional penalties for information warfare. Several executives were arrested on charges of conspiracy to defraud foreign governments. But perhaps more importantly, the exposure of the disinformation campaign actually strengthened support for the African transparency model. By attacking it with lies, the corporate interests had inadvertently validated its effectiveness and importance. They wouldn't spend millions trying to destroy our transparency system if it wasn't working, observed Ghana's President Akufo-Addo. Their desperation proves our success. Dr. Elena Marchetti's arrest in Paraguay, coordinated by Interpol and South American authorities, marked the end of the counter-conspiracy and the final victory of the African transparency movement. Her extradition to face trial in Burkina Faso was seen as a symbol of international justice and accountability. The trial, held once again in Ouagadougou with global media coverage, became the capstone of Traore's anti-corruption legacy. Unlike the first trial focusing on resource theft, this proceeding addressed information warfare and the systematic use of disinformation to undermine sovereign governments. Dr. Marchetti's conviction and sentencing to 30 years in prison sent a clear message that information warfare against sovereign nations would face the same consequences as traditional forms of exploitation and theft. But perhaps most importantly, the trial's important outcome was the establishment of new international legal precedents for information warfare prosecution. The principles developed during Marchetti's trial became the foundation for similar cases around the world, protecting developing nations from disinformation campaigns funded by wealthy interests. 5 years after the original Golden Conspiracy exposure, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before the United Nations General Assembly to deliver a keynote address on resource sovereignty in the information age. The journey from discovering illegal mining in Burkina Faso's hills to leading a global movement for transparency and accountability had transformed not just his country, but the entire relationship between Africa and the international community. The Golden Conspiracy taught us that our greatest enemies are not armies or weapons, but lies, corruption, and the silence that enables exploitation. Our greatest victory was not defeating the thieves, but building systems that make theft impossible. The statistics he presented were remarkable. African countries implementing transparency measures had achieved average GDP growth rates 50% higher than regional averages. Educational enrollment had increased by 40% in transparency nations. Healthcare access had expanded to reach 80% more citizens. Infrastructure development had accelerated to unprecedented levels. Most importantly, a new generation of African leaders had emerged from the transparency movement. Individuals trained in accountable governance, economic sovereignty, and resistance to exploitation. The Pura Institute for African Development had become a continental leadership academy, training hundreds of future presidents, ministers, and civil society leaders. Today's Africa is not the Africa that was exploited for centuries. We are educated, organized, and united. We control our resources, choose our partners, and determine our destiny. The age of exploitation is over. The age of partnership has begun. The applause that followed was not just diplomatic courtesy, but genuine recognition of a historic transformation. The small West African nation that had exposed a regional conspiracy had become the catalyst for a continental renaissance. As Traoré concluded his address and prepared to return to Africa, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from the hills of Pura to the podium of the United Nations. The Golden Conspiracy had been intended to impoverish Burkina Faso and strengthen foreign exploitation. Instead, it had awakened African consciousness and created a movement that had transformed the continent. The gold that criminals had tried to steal in darkness had indeed become the foundation for a golden age, not of foreign exploitation, but of African sovereignty, prosperity, and pride. The story that began with a farmer's discovery in the forest had become the epic of a continent's liberation. And as young Africans across the world studied Traoré's example and prepared to lead their own nations, the legacy of the Golden Conspiracy continued to inspire new generations in the eternal struggle for justice, transparency, and human dignity.